Here we are, Friday afternoon. Well, not quite afternoon, it's almost noon, but you guys are engaged at this point, I hope, with exam number 1 on chapters 1, 2, and 3. What I want to do now is I want to start chapter 4. This is Friday, so you won't get it until Saturday morning when the people at YouTube turn it loose so that I can transfer it into week number 5 for you. But anyway, we're going to start with histology on chapter 4. We're going to go a little ways into the chapter. You think about the tissues as you look at the page 123 in your textbook. You see your human body has about 200 different types of cells. That just blows my mind to think about that. 200 different types of cells, and they all have the same genetic material, but they don't all activate the same genes. How do they know to do that? That's part of the fascination that I have in the human body, just wondering how these cells know where they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to be engaged in. And so you look at that first paragraph on page 123, and it talks about each cell being specialized, but they can't perform their duties well. As you look at that third line, it says individual cells cannot perform their functions unless they're in the correct area of the body and surrounded by the appropriate cells, which would include cells like their own, but also cells that are involved in supporting them, the connective tissue type stuff. So what we want to do is maybe you can just think about your house you live in for a moment. The house we live in this body, but also the frame house that you live in. And you could look at the outside and say, oh, I like the style. It looks great. And you can go inside and say, I like the inside. But what's between the walls? We rarely ever think about that. But you got insulation in the walls to keep you warm in the winter and cool in the summer. You've got wiring in the walls, and some of the wiring is set up to let overhead lights burn, so you have light in your house. But then you got to have some different wiring when it comes to, say, your stove, because that's going to pull a lot more power. So it's going to be a bigger wire, thicker insulation, and so we're interested in, at this point, in the outside and the inside, but also what's in the middle in terms of the body. The connective tissues make a lot of things possible. So you want to consider that and think about how they work with what we call epithelial tissue or muscle tissue or something like that. So having said that, let's look over on page 124. And they give you a nice definition over on page 124, the first column. Don't forget those learning outcomes. And so you see the tissues is a group of structurally and functionally related cells. So they can carry out certain responsibilities. But notice it also says, and their external environment, that together perform common functions. So we've got, as you come down a couple of sentences, you see all tissues have the same 2 basic components: a discrete population of cells and related to structure and function, the surrounding material called extracellular matrix. Now, when we use that word matrix, you probably look at television and maybe you like that movie called The Matrix. I think it's a series or whatever. And so that may be your exposure to the word matrix. But here, it's the surrounding material in which the structural and functionally similar cells are going to be embedded in. And so the extracellular matrix helps to support them in various ways. We come down to types of tissue, and you see there are 4. You actually see 3 in that column, don't you? But you want to look at that and know the three tissues there and look at the top, you can see nervous tissues. Gives you a little bit of a picture of what we're talking about. You want to be able to define epithelial tissue. Where is it located? What's its basic structure? And what kind of cells do we find in there? I want you to look on the second column, and you look as you come down past nervous tissue, what nervous tissue can do. You see it says that organs are made up of two or more of these tissue types working together, and they list the heart. And you see they have, it's got muscle tissue in it, which is one of the tissues we'll talk about just a little bit in this chapter. Epithelial tissue, and then connective tissue. And I'm surprised they didn't put another one in there. You got to have nervous tissue in there because impulses, messages come from the little pacemaker we've got in our heart, shoots out a burst, and that has to go down through a number of structures that are nervous tissue to stimulate the muscles and so forth. So there are four tissues there that actually make up that organ we call the heart. And like it says, organs are made up of two or more of the tissues. So I just thought I'd throw the nervous tissue in there also. You can do a quick check there. That's going to give you some review and think about the functions of the tissues. So we come down to the extracellular matrix. And as you see the definition in the first sentence, it says composed of the substances surrounding the cells in a tissue. And the extracellular matrix has two components, a ground substance and protein fibers. Now, as you look at the ground substance, you come down to the next line, it talks about how the components vary. So the extracellular matrix can be a fluid, a gel, or it could be a solid. So when you think about a fluid, think about your blood. It flows, doesn't it? Yeah. You've got plasma in there. That's the ground substance. And then you see the thick gel. Think about cartilage. Cartilage is between our joints, isn't it? Between the joints in our vertebrae. And you guys ever bitten into a sausage biscuit and got something that was kind of rubbery? Maybe you swallowed it, maybe you pulled it out and put it in your little sack from Hardee's or Bojangles or something like that. That's cartilage. And so sometimes when we think we're getting just good meat, we also get some cartilage and stuff in there. And then you have a solid. When you think of a solid, think about your skeletal system. That's a solid piece of connective tissue. As you come down, you see it says the ECM is made by the cells of the tissue. That's the extracellular matrix. Cells of the tissue performs a variety of functions, some of which are now only becoming clear. Always keep in mind that we don't understand everything. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. We're always learning. That's part of the joy of this job, part of the joy that the people have in terms of studying various tissues. And, oh, I didn't know it did that. I just realized that. We're learning. We'll always be learning as long as we're studying and willing to learn. But notice the functions of the extracellular matrix. Got a couple of them here I want you to check off. The first, providing the tissue with strength to resist tensile forces. And come down to the last one, holding cells in their proper positions. That's what the extracellular matrix does. Now come on down to ground substance. And you see the bold print term there, and you come to it says it makes up most of the extracellular matrix in many cases. Ground substances contain the interstitial or extracellular fluid with water, ions, nutrients, and other solids, as well as three families of macromolecules. Now, I'm not going to get into all the big names here, but these are various types of proteins, variations of proteins. And, excuse me, If you look at the last sentence in that paragraph under ground substance, it says, in an example of the gradient's core principle, these ions create, this is in the extracellular matrix, create a concentration gradient. They use the word ECF. What does that mean? Same thing, extracellular fluid, extracellular matrix that draws water out of the cells and out of blood vessels by osmosis and effectively traps it in the extracellular matrix, and that helps to resist compression. It's easy to compress a gas like oxygen. Some of you may have taken lessons in scuba diving. I did when I was in grad school, had a little bit of time. I learned how to scuba dive, and you compress the atmospheric gas that we breathe into that tank. It's a lot harder to compress a liquid. It takes a lot more pressure. So that actually is a protective mechanism to have that water in the extracellular matrix. That's why you don't want to get dehydrated. I was reading in an article, one of the problems that older people have is they don't drink enough and they don't necessarily get all the good things that they need in their diet. Give you an example there. You want to stay hydrated. The fluid, the tissues are harder to compress, and therefore it offers a measure of protection. So let's come all the way down to the protein fibers on page 125. And you see that there are types of protein fibers. You see they're called collagen, elastic, and reticular. Those are fibers that you can find in the watery, sort of semi-liquid or semi-solid or even solid connective tissues and ground substance. And you got collagen fibers. You can read about this, know their functions. Come over to elastic fibers. That's sort of self-explanatory, isn't it? And notice where they're located. Where would you find the collagen fibers? Where would you find the elastic fibers? Actually, in the elastic fibers, you could think about the blood vessels. They have to be able to give with the beat of the heart so they can stretch a little bit. And then you come down to reticular fibers, and they, as you look in the last couple of sentences, they form a net that helps to support the tissues. And the net also tends to not allow the fluid to just swish freely. It offers resistance, and so it makes it stable. And when you think of these collagen fibers, these are all proteins, elastic fibers, reticular fibers, you know that they're different in their function. How are they different in terms of composition? Where are they made in the body? Where are these proteins produced? That was back in chapter 2. So here we are in 4, and we're bringing up material from chapter 2. So what I want you to do is once a week, read over your notes, read over the Word documents or whatever that I've given you on chapter 1, 2, and 3, because they're going to be applied in chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6. And then you think, well, okay, we get to eventually chapter 10, we will still be calling upon this foundational material. So don't think you won't see it again. I want you to turn over to page 126 in your textbook. And you look on page 126 in the second column and you see cell junctions. Does that ring a bell with you? Yeah, see, here we are already back with, I think it was chapter 3, wasn't it? In terms of the cell, when we talked about the plasma membranes and how they had these proteins. How are these proteins different from collagen? How are they different from elastic fibers and so forth? Good question, isn't it? You ought to be able to explain that. So you know about these junctions from chapter 3. So make sure you read them. They're made of proteins. Know their function and their location. And you can find those two things in these 3 paragraphs. Now, having said that, in terms of these cells, let's look over at epithelial tissues on page 127. And you see the learning outcomes. Remember to read over those so that you read this chapter as you look at the Word document, which I'll be sending to you. You want to be able to answer those learning outcomes. So we come down into this paragraph. This first paragraph says, when you look in the mirror, nearly everything you see is an epithelial tissue. And I don't know if you know it already, but we're looking at dead cells. That's what we're seeing on each other, is a bunch of dead cells, which we leave in the bed sometimes, leave on our clothes, and as we take them off, the cells in there. We're shedding cells all the time, but we're also producing new cells all the time. So as you come down the second column on page 127, you see the functions of epithelial tissue. So when you think of protection, certainly protects the muscles underneath, it protects the bone, it protects nerves underneath and so forth. And so it tends to prevent injury. Can it be cut? Yeah. Can the blow be hard enough to bruise way down into the muscle? You bet it can. But it still offers a measure of protection. One of the things it does is it prevents dehydration. We'll get into that a little bit when we get into maybe chapter 5, how the skin can prevent dehydration. But you see immune defenses. This is why you want to take good care of your skin and not have a bunch of cracks and cuts and things. I just had a young lady that I knew from a number of years ago. She was jogging, fell, and she split her knee somehow, the tissue in the knee, and apparently in the dirt where she was running, jogging along on a trail, some animal had defecated. And the fecal material from that animal got into her brake, and the next thing you know, she's in the hospital. Her leg has swollen up all the way down to the ankle, all the way up to the inguinal region of the pelvic area. It was a antibiotic-resistant organism causing the problem that was in that animal's fecal material. They did find a drug, fortunately, and her leg has reduced its swelling, but the skin, unbroken, is pretty tough to get through. So it actually keeps out viruses and keeps out bacteria. Secretion, epithelial cells form glands. We'll mention a few of those when we get to them. Transport into other tissues. We think of epithelium only being on the outside. And that's not all bad, but this is considered the outside too, because the environment comes in. And you know that we bring in food and drink and so forth, and it's epithelium that lines our 25, 30-foot GI tract. Yet we transport material from the lumen, from the space in the GI tract, through the epithelial tissue, which is usually just one layer, and then it gets into the bloodstream, and we can send it all through the body. So transportation into other tissues, like from the lumen of the GI tract into the bloodstream, they play a role in that point also. And then sensation. Sensation means we can feel some sort of a mosquito biting us. We've all had to probably do that. We felt a bug on us or whatever. So those are 5 functions of epithelial tissues. Now let's look over on page 128. And we're in the second column. We're going to look at the second half of the second column for a few seconds. And then you're going to look over on page 129 at figure 4.3. Notice as you come down into the paragraph, just past where it says figure 4.3, the cells are generally joined by tight junctions. That means stuff doesn't get between them, right? Helps hold them together, and things do not get in between. And you see they also have desmosomes that allows some transfer of information chemically, but they also stabilize the tissue. So that helps hold it together also. Makes it somewhat impermeable. As you come to the second paragraph, you see it says, notice that the epithelial tissue lacks blood vessels. So look at the picture on 4.3 and you see epithelium. Now those are nice long blocks, aren't they? Or columns. That's why they would call that columnar epithelium. And you see that there are no blood vessels there. How in the world do they get their sustenance? How do they get their oxygen and so forth? If you come back over to the 128, come down to the bottom of that section, you see it says figure 4.3 shows that essentially no extracellular matrix is present between the cells because they're all stuck together as a layer. Notice it says nothing's really between them. The ECM is located beneath the extracellular matrix, is located beneath these epithelial cells. And you see it's called a basal membrane. Sometimes they'll call it a basement membrane. And you see over on page 129, you can see the basement membrane broken into two sections. And that helps to anchor it to the underlying connective tissue. Now notice in the underlying connection tissue, there are a lot of things down there, but they have chosen to show you the blood vessels are in that connective tissue. So oxygen, glucose, other things that the columnar epithelial cells need diffuse out toward the cell. As you look over on page 129, you come down in that first column. This will be a little bit of a repetition here. Come down to it's still in that paragraph, first paragraph below the illustration. Come down the fourth line, it says over to the right, together the two layers of the basement membrane glue the epithelial tissue to the underlying connective tissue. Come on down about 5 or 6 more lines and you see the apical surface. That is the top or the surface that is exposed, in this case to some aspect of the environment. And then you see the edge attached to the deeper cells, the basal lamina or the basal surface. Okay? So you've got your epithelium, then you've got this basement membrane that helps anchor things to the connective tissue underneath. So you got 3 parts there, basically, just simply speaking. When you come down to the bottom, well, not quite the bottom, you got 1, 2, 3 paragraphs, got 4 paragraphs there, but we're looking at the third one. How do we classify these epithelium? Based on 2 criteria: the shape of the cell and how many layers, how many stratifications there are, strata are there, layers. So as you can see, up at the top, you look at the bottom 3, squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. Those are your 3 basic shapes. Now, some of you probably remember that from 110. I hope you do. That's good. If you haven't heard of it before, well, that's the basic shapes of the cells that we have in terms of epithelial tissues, okay? Now, red blood cells would look a little different from that, okay? Now, not only do we look at the shape of the cells, but we look at the number of layers. So here we have a simple epithelium, which means it's one layer thick. They're sort of like tiles. I don't know if you have tiles in your bathroom or tiles in your kitchen, but it's just one layer, and they're usually sort of flattened out. So you see, they would call that simple epithelium. When you have several layers, they'll call it stratified epithelium. So we've got two criteria by which we classify epithelial tissue. It's either simple or it's stratified. And you can see the different shapes up there. You want to know those. Second column on page 129. Here we have the examples, simple epithelium, come down to the bottom. And as you look in that little paragraph right before the very bottom, talks about simple epithelium consists of one layer, really extremely thin, not very resistant to mechanical stress. That's because they're thin, but their thinness is part of their physiology. Not only is it their anatomy, but it's also their physiology. Makes things easy to go through the cell. And you see it says they're perfect for lining hollow organs and surfaces which must, or substances must diffuse easily. So, types of simple epithelium, simple squamous epithelium. Usually they're flat. You look on page 130, and you get to see a picture at the top left, the top little kind of light purple with the dark purple nucleus. That's your simple squamous epithelium. Very thin, got some connective tissue in there. You have two pictures. The one on the left is an illustration. The one on the right, if you look at the lower right-hand corner, you'll see LM, then you see a parenthesis 530X, which means they were looking through a light microscope. There are a lot of different scopes out there. There's a phase contrast scope, there's a electron microscope and so forth, and you can go on with those. But that's a light microscope that you would use if you were actually there in the lab to look at tissue. And they've magnified it, so you really get to see what it looks like when picture taken through a microscope. You see over to the left, we're still at the top, you see where it says pleura? That is a membrane that surrounds the lung, each lung. Not only that, but it lines the cavity in which the lung resides. Very thin membrane, very soft. It's not made for playing football in the sense of being on the outside. It would be torn all to shreds. But anyway, come over to the page 131, and you're looking at the first column. Come down to the second line over to the right. Simple squamous epithelium is very thin, a fact that allows substances such as oxygen, carbon dioxide. Where would you want to have oxygen and carbon dioxide going through that cell? Your lungs got a lot of little sacs in there that are one cell thick. Makes it very easy for oxygen and carbon dioxide to pass through. Fluids and ions, they can also diffuse. And you see it says we find simple squamous epithelium lining the tiny air sacs of the lungs. That's what they're composed of. And you see it says forming the outer boundary of serous membranes. We'll mention serous membranes toward the end of the chapter. And notice also the last thing it says there, lining blood vessels. Lining blood vessels. They would call that endothelium because it's inside. Same tissue, squamous epithelium, simple squamous epithelium, but it lines the blood vessels. Eventually, when we get to capillary beds are one cell thick. And it's through the capillaries that gas goes out to nourish the cells. And CO2 comes back into the blood through those little cells. And we take the CO2 and we breathe it out. The same thing is true with nutrients. Nutrients can pass through the one cell easily. Waste products produced by the cell come out, they get into the bloodstream, and we may filter them out through our kidneys. Got to have thin cells. It's amazing how tough this body is, though. You go out and play volleyball and softball and all this. It's amazing how the body can take so much. But then there's a lot of stuff between those tiny little capillaries. You've got those muscles, and you've got connective tissues, and you've got the skin and so forth to protect it. Come on down to simple cuboidal epithelium. Instead of being flat, as the squamous cells were, squamous tells you it's a little flat like a little tile. These are like cubes. One layer. So things can diffuse through them. As you look on the second column, you see kidney tubules. Okay, kidney tubules, respiratory passages. So just to sort of focus on the kidney tubules, because what we have to do is push waste out. Got to go out easily so that we can keep the blood at the right pH, and any waste products that are in there don't accumulate and create a problem in the body. Then you come over to simple columnar epithelium. And as you look at the top, you can see the picture on the left. You can see the illustration on the left, top of 131, and you can see the columnar epithelium on the right, the real picture of it. And so the columnar epithelium are found in our small intestine. And still, with one layer of cells, we can absorb material. And one thing they're not showing on there is that when you get into the small intestine, you have these little, remember the microvilli we talked about? They're on the columnar, simple columnar epithelium. So you got a lot of absorption area. Materials can go through those little microvilli, through the cells, and then into the bloodstream. If we are talking about simple columnar epithelium, if you come on down, sometimes they're covered by cilia. Sometimes they're covered by cilia. You can find, as you read into here, at the last bit of that paragraph, you'll see it's found in the uterine tube. The uterine tubes. Those cilia push the little zygote, the little person in there, that little body that's being formed. It pushes it gently down to the uterus so that it can implant. Let's look over on page 132 for a moment. And you see pseudostratified columnar epithelium. It looks like it's stratified, but it's not. I want you to go back to page 131 and look at the bottom image. You got the real picture on the right, you got the image on the left. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium. They're not really stratified, because every cell is on the basement membrane. But you go up and you see the ends of those cells, those columnar cells. Well, that's cilia that moves, in the case of the the uterine tubes, moves the fertilized ovum down to the uterus. We also have those in the respiratory passage and up in our respiratory system up here in the nasal passage. Have you ever thought about how mucus that we produce gets pushed down into our pharynx and goes down into our esophagus. There are cells like this in the respiratory system itself. They are moving mucus out of our respiratory system, and all during the day we kind of clear our throat like that, and that sort of sweeps the mucus out. The mucus catches viruses and bacteria and dust and all kinds of stuff that we breathe all day long, and it goes down through our stomach. So it's a flushing mechanism. It helps to keep things in balance in this case, your respiratory tract and your nasal passage, which is part of your respiratory tract. On page 132, still come back to that, and you see it says transport across simple epithelia, that little paragraph there. What I'm interested in is that you come about halfway down and you see the italicized word transcellular transport. One end of the cell to the other. Nothing deep about it, but it involves what we covered in chapter 1, a concentration gradient. That's why we can absorb glucose from our GI tract into our bloodstream. There's a concentration gradient. So you want to read that a little bit there. About 8 or 10 lines, starts with transcellular transport. Now, I'm going to close it off here because we're about 36 minutes into this. And, let's tell you what, let's do this. Let's just finish stratified epithelia, which means that you've got layer upon layer. It's thicker than simple, but that means it's going to be more durable and offer some more protection. And so when you, let's look over on page 134, and we'll wrap it up after this. We'll start the next video with glandular epithelium. So here you have stratified squamous. Some people say squamous, that's okay. It can be keratinized or it can be non-keratinized. Now, when you read in there and you find out about keratin, it's a protein that waterproofs your skin and makes your skin pretty durable. It's pretty tough. Actually, our nails are made of keratin also. So it offers a good bit of protection in terms of the environment. So read that first paragraph. You come down to stratified cuboidal and columnar epithelium, and you see it says both of them are rarely seen in the human body. So we are not going to get into that at this point. Just know it's present in the body. If you need to know one place, you can come down and say, come down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines. It says it makes up the ducts of certain glands, but I'm not going to ask you anything like that on the test. I want you to know about transitional epithelium. There's a picture back on the previous page down at the bottom. You can see what it looks like, and you see transitional epithelium has now been changed. If you come down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines, you see urothelium, and uro would make you think of the urinary tract. It can stretch, and we've all had our bladders stretched, haven't we, at times? Riding in the car or whatever, I need to stop in the bathroom. And so that tissue can really stretch quite a bit. It can hold about 800 cc's of urine. So that's another type of epithelium that plays a role in our homeostasis. So when we come back, probably on a Monday, I'll make another one, and I'll start with glandular epithelium, and we'll work our way over to connective tissue proper and so forth. So anyway, we'll close it off now, and I hope you guys have a nice weekend. I will have to put this into your week 5, I believe it is. Yeah, because this is week 4. But week 5, I'll put this video in probably tomorrow morning. Have a good weekend. See you later.